you have it on?
16 by 9. Yeah.
16 by 9.
Okay, then I can add in the Ultra Studio Express.
For some reason, the stick drive wasn't working back there, so.
Funniest thing was yesterday they were in a panel and they were talking about kind of this FCC overreach. Why you can say that? Well, broadband is Title I. The ability to control. If you want to put a headset and attach it to your phone, I should be able to control the price or say you have to give it away for free because eventually it might be used for telephone service. Somebody else had, which I was going to work on. Actually, want to talk to you about.
Small cell siting and rights-of-way panel. We're glad you joined us this morning. I do want to say that I was probably either the only one or maybe one of 2 or 3 that raised their hands that were here during the 1986 Philadelphia conference. So you have probably the oldest hand here moderating the session. We do have a great panel this morning, very distinguished, very accomplished at this particular subject area. And so I want to start by introducing them. To my right, Shireen Santasham. She's the Chief Innovation Officer for Mayor Liccardo, where she leads efforts to build the smart city vision and strategy for San Jose, California. And some of you may know that San Jose's small cell siting program was recently held up as a model by one of the FCC commissioners. Previously, Shireen worked at the GSMA, where she was a director in the Mobile for Development group that aims to close the digital divide, and we'll talk about that today, for base of the pyramid populations in the developing world through mobile technology and the internet. Then next to Shireen is Mitzi Herrera. Mitzi handles planning, policy, and special projects for the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Technology Services. She is serving currently as director of the county's Ultra Montgomery program, and she'll talk about that a little bit today. It's designed to grow knowledge-based jobs in media, cybersecurity, and biotech by improving infrastructure for broadband. Mitzi has also been a member of the Federal Communications Commission Consumer Advisory Committee since 2011. Next to Mitzi is Monty McGaffigan. She's president of XG Communities, and she brings more than 25 years of communications leadership to that role. XG Communities provides cities with expertise and resources to strengthen processes and help increase wireless coverage to achieve smart city goals. Prior to being with XG, Monty held the position of Senior Vice President for a wireless coverage solutions provider responsible for venue leasing and managing carrier relationships. And she'll talk about the interplay between carriers and communities. And finally, next to Monty, is a person I know well. Michael Athay is the former longtime Chief Deputy City Solicitor for the City of Philadelphia and is now of counsel to Bradley, Birkeland, Hageland, and Herbst, specializing in telecommunications and information technology law. He joined Bradley earlier this year, and in his tenure with the City of Philadelphia, he established and supervised the law department's telecommunications, information technology, and intellectual property practices. Michael also has expertise in cable franchising, right-of-way management, and wireless facilities siting. Before I turn it over to Shireen, one of the things that I wanted to do was sort of set the baseline for you. I know many of you are already heavily involved in small cell siting and all the activities going on at the state and the federal and the local level. But for those that aren't, one of the first things to consider is that small cells are not small. They are small in coverage area, but they are not small in size. So lots and lots of them are needed, and our panel will talk about the challenges of that. It's focused on 5G, the 5th generation of wireless data communications, and the panel will go into that in a little more detail, but there's a huge push to deploy that right now for the Internet of Things and all things progressing in that area. It includes infrastructure for both single carriers like Verizon and AT&T and neutral hosts who will house multiple providers but also have, in some cases, larger installations. Here's one thing that often gets overlooked, and so those of you involved in the right-of-way, you're not only looking at attachments to structures and things in the air, but you're also looking at underground construction. The overall rollout includes primarily fiber optics. It's estimated at 80% of the total infrastructure needed for 5G deployment, primarily used for backhaul. So there's potentially lots of companion underground infrastructure. Courtesy of Mike Lynch from the City of Boston, Mike's program has been underway for a number of years, and you'll see that they've already come up with 4 and I think more standard designs to help speed the process. If your small cell installation fits one of these designs and the replacement of city streetlight poles, then you can move forward. And I think Mike's in the room, and he'd certainly be happy to talk about that a little bit as we get to the questioning period. This is an installation right here in the city, not too far from the Lowe's. And you can see again, small in coverage area that may only go 500 feet, but not small in size. Okay, so final thing. These would be mounted on pretty much any infrastructure you can think of that has the height. Existing poles, new poles, rooftops, street furniture, indoors, and Verizon in the city of Philadelphia is actually testing ground-mounted small cell deployment, manhole covers, vault covers, et cetera, which obviously would have some challenges related to snow and other kinds of obstructions. The potential, and got this from an industry panel, some of you might be from New Jersey and part of the Jersey Access Group. In a panel there, one of the industry providers indicated that they anticipate 200,000 of these across the country by 2020, so we're talking less than 2 years, and 800,000 to 2026 nationwide when they think that deployment would be satisfactory. Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce Shireen and let her tell you about San Jose.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and my goal here is just to talk for about 5 minutes about the experience of San Jose, and then really open it up to the rest of you to get the collective wisdom throughout the audience here. To start with, I think everybody knows, the next slide please, that there's a very large movement in terms of policy across the country because of the desire to deploy so many small cells at the pace that the industry would like. There's been movement at the state level, at the FCC, and also in the Senate with the Thune-Schatz bill that was recently released for comment. San Jose, as a city, has been in a unique position of really playing at all three of these levels. So with the state bill in California, SB 649, we worked with our governor and with 300 cities in California to eventually get that bill vetoed, which would, had that bill not been vetoed, we couldn't have done the work that we have done in San Jose with the carriers to deploy what we think is mutually beneficial deals that will really benefit our community. At the FCC, Mary Liccardo was on the FCC Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. We made a decision to step down from that body in January. I was his representative there, so we had sort of a front row seat to what was happening at the FCC. And the Senate bill, which is now in play, we also are in conversations with the authors of the bill. Next slide, please. So, one thing that at all three levels these bills tend to have in common is that, from our perspective in San Jose, is that there really aren't any provisions for digital inclusion. So there's a lot of rules around how much you can charge for your infrastructure. There's a lot of restrictions placed on local communities, but there's not really built into those bills requirements around making sure that you serve entire communities. We view this as essentially subsidizing the industry at below market rates for public infrastructure, and so we think it's more important to have a very balanced approach in how we speak with and work with the carriers. And finally, a lot of these bills have preemption requirements around things like aesthetics, more than shot clocks. And on the aesthetics piece, for example, in California, the SB 649 bill had size requirements that were up to 29 cubic feet plus 6 cubic feet of ancillary equipment. So you're talking about equipment that's the size of a refrigerator or larger. And so, we had to do a lot of education with our policymakers around how this could really affect local communities and the concerns we had around public safety and otherwise. So what did we do? On the next slide, you can see that we really went through kind of 3 steps. So even before all of this fast work has been happening across the U.S. on the policy side, when I first came in and joined the team with Mary Liccardo about 3 years ago, I noticed that there really was an issue with broadband in the city. So I suspected that we didn't have enough investment in broadband and that we probably had a digital divide issue. So I'm going to talk more about that in a little while. And then, how did we analyze that market in order to really incentivize private investment in our city? And then, the third element was really this negotiation point around negotiating with multiple carriers at the same time. So on the first aspect of analyzing broadband market, what we found about 3% high quality fiber in our city. We were a city that was a duopoly of 2 primary providers, and we had 95,000 residents without broadband. And over half of our low-income residents didn't have wired broadband at home. And we did a really deliberate effort on this analysis, working with the Stanford School of Education to do street surveys with our local community, because we know that the data from the FCC, the 477 data, is not very accurate. And we worked with PwC to really analyze how could we get private investment in our city. And so, really, what are the details of that approach? first of all, you know, it's really important to have a single point of contact in your city. I mean, you're going from having light poles just being light poles to light poles being actual small cells and used for a very different purpose. So you're taking, you know, very old infrastructure and you're repurposing them. And cities traditionally are not built or organized for that. And so we retooled under a single person who now carriers can go to and actually just work with, and that person can help navigate the entire city for them. Second thing we did is we did a tiered pricing model. So if carriers deploy a large number of small cells and cover the whole city, they get essentially a bulk price discount. So our tiered pricing structure for deployments over 2,000 small cells is they can get a rate of about $750, which is what we think is about market for California. So LA has similar laws, similar pricing. And so, you know, this price would be different in different communities, depending on how attractive your market is to the industry. The third thing we did is we reorganized Public Works to speed permitting. So we are doing a lot of work around staff capacity, and also about really looking at those processing times to make sure that we are accelerating deployment, which is a very attractive thing to carriers. And finally, we actually are taking the revenue from these agreements and we're investing them back into two things. One is building capacity, and the remaining funds are now earmarked. We got approval from our city council to earmark those funds for a large digital inclusion fund to close the digital divide for our city. So that will be about a $24 million fund over the next 10 years. And then finally, you know, the carriers are really interested in IoT investments and sort of proving out the test case around smart city solutions. And so we did take targeted smart city solutions that will help prove out the business case for our business partners. And so, you know, in the end, what we did is we didn't go fully for municipal fiber. We didn't think it was viable in our city. But we also didn't believe that remaining, having no intervention in the market was appropriate. And so that's how we really decided on what we call this hybrid model. So finally, the other thing we did is we wanted to create more competition for our city in the market. And so we worked with AT&T, Verizon, and Mobility at the same time to negotiate a large-scale deployment. And so by working with multiple carriers, you can create a more competitive environment if your community is a place where that is attractive to multiple carriers. So in the end, what we have is actually over 4,000 small cells that will be deployed in San Jose. We have this $24 million digital inclusion fund for our community. We have over $500 million in private investment for San Jose, and we'll have an additional 800 miles of fiber. And so it's been a really interesting journey, and we're grateful for the investment and the partnership with the carriers to get here, and we think it is a model for the rest of the country. And you know, recently Commissioner Rosenworcel published our agreements on her website as an example for other communities. Thank you.
Okay, we want the discussion to be highly interactive, and to the extent we want to make sure we get all the panelists in, but yes, please ask us any burning questions you have.
Can you expand a little bit about the reorganization of Public Works to speed deployment?
Sure. So we have a smart cities lead in our city who works in our innovation team and manages sort of the broadband governance for the city. So under him, we have a broadband manager, a policy manager, and our Public Works department now has a dotted line reporting relationship into that group so that there is accountability there. We had to create it was really essential that we created buy-in from the Public Works director to allow for that, and it was something that was understood sort of top to bottom, so a mandate from the mayor's office, as well as, you know, the city manager's office being very proactive about making sure that that was communicated to the departments.
The digital inclusion fund, how does that work and what does it accomplish?
Yeah, so we have just earmarked those dollars for the fund, and so we are now going through a strategy process, an organizational design process. So there's some questions around will that fund management sit within the city or outside the city? And we are going through those questions right now. But what I do know is that it will have some component of giving grants to local community organizations, so they have a source of digital inclusion funds. We'll look at devices, access, as well as digital literacy programs.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a very long story. That is very well covered in. Repeat the question. Oh, sorry. The question was, why did you drop off of the FCC committee? It's a very long story that is well covered in the news, so you can certainly read about it. But our view was that there was a predetermined outcome there around that was really focused on benefiting corporate interests, not the public interest. And there were many instances that we cited where local governments were not included or heard, despite trying very hard to raise their voices. And there's certainly lots of good individual folks who are working very hard on those committees, but when we first joined, we were the only local elected group on a body of 30, which was predominantly industry or industry-backed groups. Yes.
Yeah, let me take one more and then we'll move on to Mitzi. Go ahead.
Just real quick, do you think you would have been able to do this plan if the California bill hadn't been vetoed the year before?
Absolutely not. We couldn't have done this deal. I mean, we would have been preempted. The rate that was in the bill was $250 a poll. There would be no, digital inclusion fund or provision for that at all. And, we have design requirements here as well. All of that would have been out the window.
Okay, and we will have time at the end. If we've timed this right, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes left at the end too. So let me move on to Mitzi Herrera. Mitzi?
Hello, welcome, thanks for coming. Just a quick show of hands. How many folks in here are either with our potential industry partners or are currently our industry partners on small cell deployments in the room? Just raise your hand high. Okay. How many folks in here are with local governments or working on their behalf? Okay, keep your hands up for a minute. For those of you, if you are actively working on small cells or you have already done it, keep your hands up. And for those of you who have already passed some kind of small cell ordinance, keep your hands up. Okay, so good smattering of folks. Partly, okay, good. All right, and then anybody in here from the press? Okay.
One guy.
It's okay. One thing I do want to point out before I begin is I want to recognize Margie Williams is sitting here in the front in the white. Margie is our franchise manager, and she is the tower committee coordinator. And so Margie is the frontline person who deals with all the providers. She gets most of the public calls. She deals with a lot of the ins and outs and the nuts and bolts. And she's a very good resource. And she's just shy, which is why I'm sitting up here instead of she is. Okay, next slide. So I think what we wanted to kind of do is to kind of keep this short, and there can be more questions just sort of focused on the process. If you're of doing this, what are the kinds of things that you really ought to be looking at? So one is, it's very helpful if you have an ordinance or something that you have to pass through any kind of elected council, having held some kind of public meeting, getting some kind of public input, releasing drafts, speaking with people in your community, socializing it with different groups can be very helpful to the process. Inevitably, somebody who is opposed to it will come in and say, well, this is just too rushed, and the fact that you've had it, for us, we've frankly actively been working on these things for 2 years, and we've done various steps along the way. One of the things that we also did is that we split the process, and we ended up going forward with a bill that addressed everything sort of more in commercial areas and mixed-use housing, and then we split off the residential piece because there were a lot of things that people could agree in some areas where you've already got a Panera Bread or you've got a lot of those things they were a little bit more okay with, so that can also be something in there. But one thing to think about in the process is that we have probably a good core of 6 dedicated people who, I wish I could put them all on staff because they seemingly have a lot of time to do a lot of research. And there's probably a core of like, say, 20 people that have turned up at least at every of the community meetings we've had. But in that same 2 years, we have added 55,000 wireless telephone lines in Montgomery County. So whereas some folks will say, well, we have enough broadband or we don't need it, when industry comes and says that there is growing demand, we do have evidence that there is a demand. And part of what you have to think of at the beginning is, what is your goal in doing this? Part of it is that we compete in a region, in the Washington, D.C. region, with other jurisdictions. Our biotech market competes with other folks. We have a labor force that is constant churn, and we want to grow, and we want to attract new millennials. And part of that, the future is wireless. And those folks are going to want access to the services. And we want to be a test bed for a lot of the new Internet of Things and a lot of these smart city concepts. And so that means that you have to have a zoning that's in line that allows you to do some of these things, but you don't have to go so far as that I'm going to give away everything and we don't care what it looks like. The important thing to think about as well is that everybody is selling the sizzle of 5G, but in fact, most of what you're seeing for deployment now is ways to make the 4G network more efficient through densification. But that said, there still is a demand for that, and what you will likely see is that once antenna standards and devices actually get deployed, people will come back out and they'll want to swap out those antennas. So having a process that kind of deals with that is important. Can we go back for a minute? Back. Okay. Just in this last part, the last what I want to show you is Montgomery County, although we are adjacent to Washington, D.C., about 500 square miles, about a third of the county is that area in green, and it is an agricultural reserve. And what you can see, those little faint dots there, are all the places where the new providers, we already have about 1,200 antennas deployed at 500 locations. These are places where people want to put new 5G. None of that is going to the agricultural reserve. 5G is not coming to rural areas. And anybody who tells you that is making a gross misrepresentation. Next slide. All right. There's no reason why you want to treat all the poles and the zones the same. One thing I would emphasize is that if you have particularly state legislation where they want to say that wireless, that every area should be charged the same, you will exacerbate the rural-urban digital divide. Because if you price the areas that I most want to serve, that have the most concentration of customers, the same as the places where the market has already left behind, you will simply incentivize putting more deployment in the urban areas and less in the rural areas. Just stay for a second. Part that's difficult in this is that you're drafting a code and it's going to apply in a lot of different situations, and if you're like us, you have different size poles and different type things. One of the things that can be very helpful to you is mapping. Most of you have a GIS department. We have already had layers, like we had a layer of all our streetlights because we had done an app if you have an outage of a streetlight and where you can repair that. We have zoning. We map all of our tower locations. So putting those things all together visually can help you understand the picture, where your things are going, where you have gaps, other holes. Incentivizing. We have had a long-term process in which if you were co-locating on an existing building or an existing structure, that did not require a public zoning hearing. We looked at our process to say, okay, if you're in commercial areas, the setback may be closer, but this class could be without a zoning hearing. And for these other ones, we would reserve the right to have one. Whether your zoning applies in the rights of way, ours does, not everybody does, but for us particularly where we're building a lot of new mixed-use residential types of things, what that street looks like is part of the whole design of the community, and so what the poles that get installed there is an important piece of that. And then the question there is the right-of-way access should be different from the pole access. Everybody has a right essentially to be in the right-of-way, but what I do with my property as the property owner, I have a bigger say in that. Whether the streetlights are owned by the local government or the utility will also make a difference. Next slide. All right. I already sort of stated on these commercial use, and I'm going to show you a couple pictures quickly. Underground areas are probably the most difficult to deal with. We have had it in our subdivisions. Any subdivision approved after July 1st, 1967 has to have underground utilities. So roughly half the county has them and half the county doesn't. When you're installing things on utility poles, we had a big storm come through. We've had 70-foot utility poles in residential areas because they abut a large street. People may complain about adding things, but I have less problem with adding to this pole that's got a lot of other stuff on there as opposed to when you're in a neighborhood and there's nothing there but a 12-foot pole. Height increases, what we looked at, we're doing things, you can try to do a fixed one, the utility poles will cause a problem. Look at your own jurisdiction. Some of them may be relative height increases. So you could increase up, adding 10 feet. If the street was wider, it might be a little bit different. In some cases where we had poles, what we're now looking at in the residential areas is if the poles, we basically have two classes of streetlights. They're either a 12-foot pole or a 25-foot pole. You can conceal equipment a lot better on a 25-foot pole. In those cases, they may be able to go forward without a zoning review if we pass a bill that we're working on. And in the shorter ones, they may still have a zoning review because they're more difficult to make stealth. And one thing I would say, you'll see a couple vendors who are out there and encourage you to talk to them. Design can be beautiful, and it should. We spend a lot of money in jurisdictions. The way that I like to think of this whole problem that we've got is you have a community in which taxpayers have paid to do all the things that make people want to live close together. Schools, libraries, transit, fire stations. Now you have an industry that comes in their state bills and say, we pretty much want access to this for almost nothing. And we should be able to deploy where we want and not have to deploy if we don't want to, and I'm going to charge whatever I want. And I don't have to offer any discounts for low-income people, and I don't have to put any money into training programs. And then if there's any gaps in there, well, the taxpayers can come back in and they can fund that too. And that's not a starting place for us. Last couple things here, just quick pictures. This is what I'm talking about, a utility pole. You can also see that on one side of the street you have an apartment building, and on the other side of the street you can have a residential area. So when you're zoning things and you're kind of looking at what you can kind of do, you have to kind of take into account some of these nuances. Here you will see this is a standard 25-foot pole that we would have out there, and you can see on the right is a picture of mock-up from Crown Castle of what they would do in something like that. And you can see that in this area, you could maybe potentially have it in a way that people wouldn't really take a look at it. The reason why you want to use poles is because every one of these antennas requires power, and it requires a pair of fibers for each provider. That stop sign, while it is a pole, to me is not appropriate to say, oh, because you have a stop sign there or a street sign, that becomes something that I can do. And almost every state bill that at least the ones we've seen in Maryland, want to convert that to say that if you have a street sign there, that could be a future spot for a 50-foot pole. Next. This one here you can also see in the residential neighborhood. You'll see right in front, to the right of that yellow trash can, there's a pole. When somebody bought that house is their biggest asset that they own. That's their retirement. And they look at it and they are concerned about what is suddenly going to come up. And when we put these things in, utility poles almost always sit between properties, but streetlights, kind of wherever we put them. And you can see that that's from Ocean City, that pole, and you can see why some people may have concerns about, well, that's different. So we may, at least initially, say that we're going to have a different process for that, and you might, as you get to a design, if you can get to some designs, you might be able to move to a process where you say, well, if you pick one of these designs, then maybe you don't have to have a zoning review. And then lastly, I will just show you this. What this map is basically showing you is that when these applications come in, one of the things that we found when we went and analyzed is that 76% of the applications filed with us are incomplete. And there's a number of things. They're either the wrong address, the wrong size, something's missing. The FCC rules used to say that the shot clock starts when the application is complete, but they changed that to say, well, now it starts when you file it, and then now the onus is on us to point that out, to process that application. The blue is the part that actually counted towards the shot clock. And what we found is that 80% of our delays were caused by 4 specific people being late in getting back information. And that's partly why what we're also looking at is in changing our fee process so that if you have to refile them, after a certain date, they age out, and you'll have to come back. And that's kind of it, and I'm open to any questions.
Okay, we have time for a couple questions for Mitzi. Again, if you have some right at this moment. Anything? Yeah, Jerry.
Mitch, could you go back to that last slide? I don't think I've ever seen that before. So this is actually a report card that the industry can look at and see which of the local contractors
Right.
went right and do it on time.
Right, and our intention is, and you can do this either if you're a large jurisdiction or if you want to do it on a regional basis, is to actually put out a report that's sort of talking about for these specific providers, because these filers are kind of subcontractors, and they'll move around, and so, you know, this is what we've actually gotten, and the fact is that we've said to the industry, it's on you to police your own people, and maybe by imposing a $200 to $500 refiling fee, it will wake you up to the fact that these people are filing these applications that are just missing information.
Incomplete.
Yeah.
Hi, this question is for Shireen. When you talked about the digital divide, were you including local broadband as well as cable in terms of the digital divide?
So we designed the study so that we could actually look at, you know, wireline and wireless. Oh, sorry. When her question was, when you looked at the digital divide, did you look at wireless versus wired internet? And we did. So we actually have very good data on which parts of our community are using wired versus wireline. And low-income populations are predominantly wireless, mobile. But we also found that when we asked those families who have children in school what device their children are doing their homework on, it was a laptop. So what we can draw a conclusion is that wireless is not sufficient alone for doing homework. It can be used as a mobile hotspot potentially. Many of the families told us that the $10 a month low-cost plans were still too expensive for them. And so we had very strong indications that if we really want to bridge the divide, that we will have to provide other mechanisms for those families. And that's why we created the Digital Inclusion Fund. We don't expect that industry will be able to serve all of those customers, especially at the very lowest tier at those rates, but certainly as a local government, we have an obligation to make sure everybody has access. And you know, we're the largest city in Silicon Valley. We shouldn't be leaving our own behind in the process.
Okay, let me go ahead and move on to Monty, so we can keep things moving, and I promise we'll get back to your question.
Come back to some questions. Well, thank you, Mitzi. Thank you, Shireen. That was great. Monty McGaffigan with XG Communities. Really happy to be with you all today. We are headquartered in California, and we are a firm that was built out of the problems and the opportunities that Shireen and Mitzi just talked about, and that is that there's just an awful lot going on in this space right now. This 5G explosion, 4G densification, carriers coming at you from every which way but loose, the subcontractor has a subcontractor, IoT, M2M, V2V, automated cars. It's really, really a confusing space right now. And so our firm sits on the side of the municipality and the jurisdiction to make sure that you really have a complete story and an understanding of what's happening out there, and that you maintain control of your city and your right-of-way. So that's what we're here to do, and hope to help you here. So Tom is driving today. Again, what's happening is there is just a major explosion of wireless technology. You guys are all living it every day, and I know everybody out here has lots of kids, and they've all cut the cord and are just sitting there on their phones all the time. So what happens when new spectrums are released, et cetera? The carriers have to upgrade and evolve their networks. There were some numbers thrown out here that by 2020 there'd be 800,000 of those, or 2026. I've actually heard by 2020 there'll be 1 million. So the forecasts vary. You talk to the OEMs, the manufacturers, the carriers, and you'll hear all kinds of different numbers. But at the end of the day, you can kind of think about, in terms of population, about 1,000 people to one small cell is about where we are right now, and in the next few years it'll be about 300 to 1. So really important you get in front of this stuff, especially when you think about property values, aesthetics, the way these things look. It really, really matters that you stay on the forefront of this and really get ahead of it. Next slide. So, where are these things going? We've talked about it a lot. In the right-of-way, light poles are a very obvious choice. What has happened in the past, just to give you a little bit of history, was macro towers. The big trees, the big erector sets that are all over the country. There's about 350,000 of those that exist today. So they're having to infill those with the small cells or densification. And so now they're looking for, it's too expensive to go do private property leases with every building owner, that kind of thing. So they're coming to you as cities that own a lot of this infrastructure so that they can very easily and predictably get their stuff out and get it to densify the market. Okay, so what does XG do? We sit on the side of the city to help you with that effort there. Really, our business model is to help you create that strategy, to do some planning, to create some predictability, systemization, digitization. You talked about scorecards and report cards. That's fabulous stuff. It's really hard. Some cities are further ahead than others. Some of you have resources, and others of you have found that this is now, you're accountable for this, and you said, hey, how did I get this job? I had another job a few years back. So I know everybody is kind of pulling their hair out here and struggling a little bit to think about how do I take this on, and what's the appropriate methodology for moving this forward in my city. Do I need to add additional resources? Do I need to hire expertise? Do I just kind of stand back and wait and let legislation take care of these things? All those questions are popping up in your mind, and as you're thinking through the business cases that you heard here today, everybody's in a little bit of a different stage, but there is a huge opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive here. And I urge you to do so, because you can maintain control and get what you want and need for your city. And by the way, the carriers I spent 20 plus years with a carrier. They're good people, but they have their own agenda. And there's a lot of them. There is a lot of them. And they'll come at you from a lot of different angles, again, with subcontractors and different folks. And it can be very, very overwhelming. So it's very important that you stay educated and make sure you've got an organized strategy and methodology. Sales pitches and and what I tell cities that I deal with, and what I tell carriers is, you want what they have. This is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. You want to open up your arms because there's really great outcomes for your cities. In terms of economic growth, in terms of addressing digital divide, in terms of all these things. So you want what they have. You just want to do it in such a way that you maintain aesthetic control. You continue to have control over location, placement, and of course, a revenue stream for your city. We are currently, as XG Communities, we have relationships and partnerships with about 40 cities. We see huge strength and power in numbers, hence this conference is going on today. It's really important for you all to be collaborating and talking together, and there is a lot of collective bargaining that can happen when the cities stay united in terms of your rights and your goals and objectives. And I did want to comment on one of the things that we've been citing, the San Jose agreement that was done as it's been touted out there as really a very powerful agreement, and I congratulate you guys. I know you all did a lot of work, and Kip and Dolan and the entire team were very, very strategic and have given a lot of thought to this over several years, not just the past year. But what's interesting is as we go and represent our cities and talk to the carriers, and that agreement in particular got a lot of accolades and press, the carrier said, we don't want to do that agreement with other cities. No, thank you. we offered it up to a couple of our cities. Said, we'll take that agreement. We can stop negotiating now. We'll just take that agreement and do exactly what they're doing. And they said, no, thank you. Okay, so what is really happening here? There's just a lot of confusion. The carriers are kind of coming at this from a lot of different angles. The financial piece, they're waiting for legislation to pass in some cases. It is really, really important that you stay very educated there and understand what your rights are and what the pieces of the deal need to be. It's a very complicated process. So Site Selects is one of the tools that I wanted to spend just a couple minutes highlighting, and then I'll hand it over to Michael here to kind of wrap us up. But Site Selects is an online reservation tool, and the backstory here is kind of an interesting one. Some of you cities may have found yourself here, hopefully not. But as you may or may not know, before a carrier comes and puts an application on the permit desk, they spend generally somewhere between 18 to 24 months engineering, let's call it almost in a vacuum. They're out there doing RF studies, they're figuring out where there's coverage gaps, they're thinking through what assets may or may not be available, and they're doing some engineering to figure out if this is going to make sense, it's going to pass structural, whatever. And then they put an application on the desk. Well, what's happening in some cities and what happened to us before we had this tool is essentially we double sold a bunch of poles. And the carriers are like, well, wait a minute, I was there first. We had to go, tracking through emails and all that kind of stuff to say, no, it was this guy who was here a couple days before you were, and this and that. And so it cost the carriers a lot of money. And wasn't fun for the city either, because they're like, hey, we don't know, we don't care, just pick another pole. Well, that's not really a great solution either. And so what we did is we worked with our friends and partners, Deloitte, and have developed an online reservation tool. And essentially think a Ticketmaster for city assets, if you will, where you can really digitally go on the KMZ files, and the city-owned assets have already been rationalized by the cities. They've said, yes, you can market these assets. No, these are historical districts. We don't want small cells there, or whatever it might be. But here's what we've got. Here's an online system and a dashboard that the carriers can then come in and select a pole, get a timestamp receipt, digitize the buying process, so none of this 40-page documents. We're trying to bring everybody into the 21st century if we can. It seems like an obvious thing to do, but you can imagine how difficult it actually is. But to get the licensing agreement into a digital process. The other piece to this that's really compelling, or will be compelling to cities as we move forward, is keeping a database or an inventory. We're in the first wave of small cells. The second wave will come right behind this. There's going to be moves, adds, changes. What you don't want to do is get a nice, pretty one built, and a year later they come by and want to do an upgrade or a move and a change, and you lose complete control of what's out there. You don't have as-built or good, clean pictures and a good database. And I know you all struggle with this, but the databases that exist today, the inventories sets that are out there in cities are in varying degrees of stages, and it's a moving target because poles get knocked down, they get moved, there's redevelopment, there's stuff going on. So we're trying to address that problem from a bigger picture and solve that. And I think that's about it, other than just some kind of pictures. So again, we're here to help you, and look forward to having live conversations with you about this. But it's a great opportunity, but it's very, very complex, and there's a lot of moving parts. So it's important that you really take the time to make sure you've got a strategy in your city. Thanks.
Okay, before we move on to Michael, any questions for Monty? Yeah, Rick.
You are, yes.
Let me ask as follow. Is there anything specific in the deal that you can sort of point to?
Yeah, well, the feedback that I got from two major carriers, you can kind of guess who they were, was that the economics were really too rich, and therefore that they wouldn't want to repeat that kind of a deal across the board.
I just want to clarify.
Well, Shireen can
Yeah, and I just want to clarify this point. I mean, the carriers signed the deals, right? So the economics worked for them in San Jose. And for the communities that you live in, I mean, we are, you know, the largest city in Silicon Valley. We are an attractive market for carriers. And so the things that you need to think about replicating are not our pricing exactly, but what are the economics that work for your community? And so that's why I think it's really important to analyze up front what your broadband market looks like, what your digital divide looks like, so that you can come up with terms that work for your community. Because in your community, the pricing might be much less, or you might be willing to give away more in one area in order to get benefits in another. And the elements that work are understanding your broadband market. So like, don't jump to municipal fiber. That's a really difficult model. Like, are there ways you can incentivize investment? If there really isn't, then maybe you consider municipal fiber. Think about, the density of your population. I mean, that's what drives the economics for carriers, and you've got to understand their business model and their business interest, right? And so that's what is going to be important. Then you also need to think about how easy are you to work with. So retooling your workforce. I mean, that's very attractive. I mean, you've got sales teams that are incentivized to, meet their quarterly numbers or annual numbers. And so if you can speed deployment, that's a good thing, right? And so, I think there's a lot of things that you can do, but the across the board saying that the San Jose agreement is not an attractive agreement is not an accurate statement, considering that the companies obviously found the economics good for them.
And I would just echo that, because I do a lot of work, because we have a rural area with the Maryland Rural Broadband Task Force, and I point out that John Lyons is here. He's actually the deputy director for the new Governor's Office of Rural Broadband. You may not, it is my argument, I would not price things in downtown Baltimore the same as I price them out in a rural community. But that said, I actually don't think that what you price it makes a difference, because deployment is still going to be driven by where is the dense consumers who want to buy my service and what are my construction costs. But the other things to think about is that in some cases you may want cash, and otherwise there's other considerations, particularly if I have to go out, if a provider's going out and they're installing fiber to reach those providers, getting a couple strands may be the thing that I want. One issue we have is we have public parks. They sit kind of further away. We haven't built to them. But if you did a deal where you can come in, you can install a light for me, so now you can use the park after dark, you can put your stuff up, but I've got some fiber that now I can use for a security camera, or I have something else that I can leverage for more Wi-Fi in that park, and it can become a win-win situation. But those things only exist on the table if you're not precluded under federal or state law from cutting public-private partnerships. And I think that you should also, it does a disservice to everyone if you don't want things in your community to price them in a way that I'll say I'm doing it, but I'm pricing it in a way that I don't. I don't know that many communities are doing that. I think most communities want to have these services within there, and they want industry to provide these things. We just simply want to have a reasonable management of this.
Okay, let me take one more question, and then we'll move on to Michael. Go ahead.
On the full reservation process, is there a charge for that? And then how long are they able to have access to that pole?
Yes, there is a one-time fee to make the reservation, and then every city has input onto how long they want to allow the reservation to last. What we're seeing is most cities time out at about a year is usually their thought, because they don't want to have people, crowd out or reserve assets that they don't intend to build on.
One point I would build on that just to say is, we right now under our permitting have a requirement that when you go and get a permit, regardless of what you're doing, you have to use it within 6 months. I think the director could give you another 6 months. The problem you have is that where you look at these shot clocks where they say, well, you've got to review it in 60 days or 90 days. Well, do you have to build it in 60 or 90 days? So one thing to look at is that my ability to grant you something, it may only be good for a certain period of time. And if you haven't built within that period of time, then you'd have to come back. And that can be a way that you can get the providers, you know, this, some of you remember 2 years ago in Austin when we were talking about this, and mobility came into the county and they said, you know, I don't even remember the number, 120 locations that we like to build. And they weren't planning to build them for a couple years. But the idea that now I've got to approve and go through all of those in some 60 to 90 days is crazy. Because now you've done all this, plus you have all these residents who are now up in arms about the fact that you've approved all this, but nothing's actually coming.
Okay. Let me go ahead and move on to Michael Athay. Michael?
Good morning. These first two slides are kind of giving you a little bit of a summary of what 5G is about. I think everyone in the room either knows this now or will by the end of the conference. So let's move through those two to the third slide. Okay, next one, Tom.
Oh, sorry.
I'm not going to spend an hour and a half or 2 hours talking about each of these bulleted items. The point I want to make is that everything on the list is really bad for us. Everything on the list goes to the limiting or elimination of our authority to control wireless facilities entry into our rights of way and any compensation that we might get, including for city property. In some ways, the most threatening, though I may be saying this just because we're dealing with it now in Pennsylvania, the most threatening item on the list is the last state legislation that is, believe it or not, worse than the BDAC model ordinance certainly in the case of Pennsylvania's. I want to say just a little bit about that piece of legislation in order to impress you with the extent of the threat. And I think that probably most jurisdictions in this country, most states in this country, most of the states are going to be doing this kind of pro-industry, industry-driven, industry-friendly legislation. I don't think it's just Pennsylvania. Ohio, Colorado, there's a list of states that have it. Now, I think everybody really has to be attentive to this kind of legislation and be prepared to fight it. To give you some examples of why, the definition of a small cell facility, up to 35 cubic feet of antenna plus equipment cabinets. Tom's slide, the Philly slide, or a Philly installation showed you what that can mean in practice. The poles can be up to 50 feet. So think about hundreds of 50-foot poles with that kind of installation on each of them in the blocks surrounding this hotel, Center City, Philadelphia. And it's not a good thought. And I think it's very much what we're looking at. I think it's a real possibility, given what we've been hearing, particularly today, about densification, what that's going to mean in terms of numbers of antennas. Well, I don't mean to be alarmist, but this is serious. I mean, it really is kind of scary. It's scary for what our cities are going to look like. It's scary for what the quality of life in our cities will be. And another thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about pedestrian level, close to pedestrian level facilities in many cases. And as they become more and more dense, our citizens' concern about that which we're not citizens about legitimate concerns as these antennas at pedestrian level proliferate. one example of what we have to be concerned about. In the Pennsylvania bill, the compensation is $25 a year per facility. Philadelphia recently enacted a regulation governing wireless installations and adopted a master license agreement for municipally owned property, poles, and so on, traffic light standards. For the municipal property, we want $3,000 a year. Well, there's no compromise there. If the legislation passes, $25. It's ridiculous. I mean, it does not compensate us for any part of the management of the right-of-way, and it's a huge subsidy on the part of our taxpayers for this one industry. We think that $3,000 is reasonable, and it's not altogether that unusual because it does recover our costs. It does come some way to compensating our taxpayers. Shot clocks, of course, 60 days, 60 calendar days to approve or deny, deemed approved if we miss the deadline. Batch applications, as many as they want, as often as they want. And access to municipal poles in the right-of-way is mandated at a fee of $50 per attachment per year. So they have the right to come onto our property for $50 a year if this legislation passes.
If you had your wedding in a city park in Philadelphia, you would have to pay more.
So and moratoria, of course, are prohibited by the bill. Well, given that this kind of legislation is becoming more and more common, and given that my laundry list of regulatory provisions is not great for us, I think the fair question, since we're going to have to deal with this industry, is what do you do about it? How do you cope in this very hostile regulatory environment, which is not likely to get better, certainly not with this commission? And I think the point I would like to make is that you can negotiate with the industry, with the tower companies and with the carriers. The experience in Philadelphia has been that they would rather talk to us if it will expedite their getting in than rely on their parallel strategy of preempting us. And they don't really want to get into litigation in order to get into the right-of-way. The last thing that the carriers want, or the tower companies, the last thing that they want is the kind of delay that goes with a real fight. Now, that is leverage. That is leverage for us. And I think it makes it at least possible, assuming we don't just get across the board preempted. So that political fight and that political risk is still there. But assuming that we still have a ball game, then I think that it is possible to negotiate with the industry if you are prepared to make certain obvious kinds of, I wouldn't call them concessions, because it might actually be good for us too, along the lines of streamlining the process. Mike Lynch told us yesterday that Boston is approving applications in 28 days. And so there's an example of how it can be done. I think that in order to negotiate successfully with the industry, you have to offer them the one thing they want the most, and that is the fastest possible entry with the least costly to them process.
You can't do that for $100 for an application fee, right?
And that is the application fee under the Pennsylvania bill. No, of course you can't. That's a taxpayer subsidy too. What we're going to do, we're not looking at losing that fight. I mean, we're looking at winning the fight. in Harrisburg.
But I would say that I think a key piece of battling on the state legislative front is actually taking action at the local level. I think because the more that you demonstrate that there are local solutions, and to some extent, I think that, you know, where you have a replication, where you might have a lead community and then other folks adopt something that looks just like it, can be a good thing. You know, you can have, I think also having the same ground rules, the price, the exact price may vary between communities, but if the process is somewhat similar, I think that's helpful too.
Could you move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think,
Well, the last point I want to make, actually a set of points about what you can do with your agreements, with siting agreements. And I think it's important that that all of us look at our form siting agreements, the agreements we've used historically, and rethink them in light of the present quite exigent circumstances. So I think every jurisdiction needs to be looking at revising its form agreements. Same for your row ordinance. That's a little more complicated process. The kinds of things that you should be looking at go to streamlining the process. Boston has used a strategy that seems to me to be quite a good one, and that I think we should all consider. The way they handle their approval process is to pre-approve facilities for a given carrier, and so that there's no facility evaluation as part of the process. That happens before the application process. It happens as part of the right-of-way use agreement, and the approved facilities are specified in the agreement. So that what has to be done by the Public Works Department is to look at and approve locations. And that, if the facilities are already approved, then that can be a faster process. You have to look at things like GIS mapping. You have to look at your process and how it's staffed to determine whether you really are doing things as efficiently as you can. You need to be able to commit to a short time for approving locations. You reserve the right to the municipality to say no to locations, though I think it's quite important that you do that on a rational basis. I mean, apart from what the commission tells us we have to do, as a matter of bargaining, as a matter of successful bargaining with the carriers and the tower companies, it's important to have good reasons. You can agree on a number of locations that the carrier can apply for in a given month in order to prevent yourselves from being overwhelmed. I mean, these are things that you can do in your agreement that will help streamline the process, and because helping the carrier get in faster, assuming that you can really offer that streamlined shorter time to get in, will give you a basis for negotiating. Another thing that you can do in order to help streamline it is to use a single agreement for facilities on city-owned poles in the row and non-city poles, so that you're dealing with both in your right-of-way use agreement, and the carrier is authorized for the entire inventory, I mean, subject to location approval, for the entire inventory that is in your right-of-way. I think if you make it clear that you are willing to go to war if necessary, if there can't be agreement, and can offer a streamlined and more expedited means of getting in, then I think you're in a pretty good position to bargain to reasonable compensation and terms that do not give away your ability to regulate how they're using the row and even numbers of facilities.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, panel. We have about 6 or 7 minutes before we're supposed to break and go to lunch, so let's open it up.
It seems to be there's agreement on the panel that a local deal would be better than state or federal preemption. I'm just wondering, how do you convince people in your own community, that can come to zoning meetings or at RF emission concerns, things like that? How do you convince them that's a good idea to have a local law or ordinance that allows these small cells in?
So I think that one, helping people to understand that there is demand is an important piece of it. I think that articulating when people have reasons, so for example, when people may talk about the radio frequency, RF emissions. Montgomery County in particular has done quite a bit of lobbying with the FCC to try to get it. I think we actively believe that they should not have the authority to do it. It should probably move to something like NIST, somebody who's actually going to take action on it. I think where you look at where people have some specific concerns, where you can address those concerns and you incorporate them in, or that you articulate the reasons why you didn't or why you modified that. And to some extent, the federal law already states that you cannot have the effect of prohibiting these things. But that doesn't mean they just have to go everywhere. So, we're already actively working, and I think the same way that when we had tall towers that came in the mid-90s and you had to kind of update and refresh a few processes and create them, now you're going to have them and they're deployed closer to the neighborhoods. You can come back and do that. But what people also want to know is when somebody comes in and says, this is what I'm going to build, that's what they actually built. And it's on the industry, frankly, to say, we'll just say no to ugly. We just actively, on our own, will say it will not look like a circuit board that's installed on your pole, to the extent you have some of that. So the enforcement piece, I think, is a big thing. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, I see Jane Builder here, I see Rebecca Hunter from Crown. At the local level, most of the providers want to work with you. And we've kind of come up with reasonable compromises and what these things look at. The problem is there's a total disconnect between their government staff at the state and the federal level. And I will say that what is frustrating from the local side is that when you go through and you engage the citizenry and you come up with a reasonable compromise, that they turn around the next day and they're, if not the same day, and they're at the state legislature saying how we need to preempt what we just helped support to pass. And that's not helpful.
And I'd just like to add that, communities by and large want broadband. They want a lot of it, we pay more for broadband in this country and have less choice than almost every other developed country. And so, the notion that cities are the problem in holding up this process is simply not true. There are areas of overlap and mutual agreement, and in our agreements, we also helped speed processes. The carriers were happy to upfront significant funds so that we could build capacity in public works to speed permitting. And so there is a way forward here, and it is unfortunate that the national conversation is not in line with what's happening at the local level.
Yeah, Rick.
I was struck with the figure that 80% of the delays are caused by 4 specific people. Is that 4 contractors typically?
Yes. And, and Shireen talked about just sort of revamping the process and looking at those. Let's just sort of put this in context. Our permitting department approved 60,000 permits and another 120,000 transactions. Of those, less than 300 were for wireless. So this other notion that somehow we have to upend the whole thing, and when you're talking about 4G, the idea that, we couldn't pay cost-based permitting fees because we have this, is nonsensical. But there are things in looking at our process. One of the things that we did is we treated things that were deployed in the right-of-way different than we did if they were attached to a building. But what that meant is that it didn't have a specific zoning review to determine that the height, that it didn't make sure that if you said you're going to be on this pole, that's the pole that you actually got on. And that created a lot of problems with community people who went around and did the research and looked at that. So again, I say, really look at your enforcement procedures, look at how your public works or your permitting department works, and then whoever is controlling access to both your poles and to the utility, all those folks need to be involved in the conversation. And lastly, I would say is that sometimes you have these various agreements and people wrote them at a time when we weren't really focused on some of these, so finding a mechanism to sort of true them up, or to say that to me really is, you look at some providers who are former Bell companies who've been in the right-of-way, and they got the right to be there because they were going to provide service to every home, and now they're essentially just cherry picking and determining where I can do it, and they're even turning on the neutral hosts. When the neutral hosts say, well, sure, I'll pay a fee, or I can do this, the carriers will come in and say, well, but then those fees are passed on to us and we don't agree with that. And so there is a split between those folks. I think the other thing to just generally look at is, if you found out in a market, what is a neutral host charging for a site? My thinking is that the municipal fee should probably not exceed that. You have to have a pretty good reason or some pretty unique location of why that is. But that will help you understand, what is the market? A fair market value is what other people are paying in the market. That's how you do housing appraisal. There are other costs that go into that. But again, I think that for most communities, we want those services in there. We do want to address the digital inclusion and the digital divide issues. But we also want to make sure that these things that are deployed in our community look good, because they will be there for a very, very long time.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Jerry.
Tom, I assume, I mean, get you to play more than just moderator, I assume that you were the consultant in the city of Philadelphia for the ordinance that Tom just referenced. Could you give us some of your thinking behind where the $3,000 came from? And is that citywide, or is that just for Center City, or how did that happen?
Yeah, it's couple things, and our panelists have talked about that. The $3,000 that the city charges, and again, this is for access.
The reason I'm asking, by the way, is Crown Castle has made that a cause celeb at the FCC.
Exactly, even though, again, multiple providers have signed the agreements, as we were talking about, so obviously they believe that it's fiscally doable. But it was, again, based on a look at city's cost, actually, when you think about it, and it's related to the access to municipal property, all the things that go into it on an annual basis. Because remember, you have the basic application fee, but then annually, and the city's agreement goes out for a number of years and then can be renewed. So really, there was a substantial look, and if you look at the agreement, unfortunately, Monty, it is a 40-page agreement, but there was a lot of work that went into it, a lot of development of ordinances over time, meeting with, and I think one of the things that the panelists talked about today is making sure that you have coordination on the city side. So having coordination with the streets department, who the agreement is with the mayor's office, interested council committees, with OIT, who's now gotten substantially involved, also, and the law department because of the activity at the state. And then the final thing, there's a certain number that have that fee, but after that it declines. So as the rollout continues, there's an incentive based on a lower and lower annual fee. Yeah, so again, I mean, this wasn't lightly thought of. Nobody picked that number out of a hat. Clearly, the city spent a lot of time and effort, and certainly has been up in Harrisburg advocating that they shouldn't be used as a target, but rather as an example of the work that you go through to demonstrate your cost and demonstrate how to set up the rollout so that it is beneficial.
And I just want, Sharina and I were just talking, that if I have this right, in the San Jose agreement, if you agree to deploy more throughout the city, the cost is lower than if you're just going for single sites, which is another way that you basically use market incentives in a capitalist country to actually get the things you want.
And that's the same thing in Philadelphia, it's a cheaper price.
Yeah.
Baltimore City's got the same in that, but theirs is a little different in that it's a volume discount. If you use more, the
Right.
price goes down. But it's not quite, I think, the San Jose, which is really trying to get at addressing that digital divide by really incentivizing you to actually do a wide deployment that reaches everyone.
Yeah, and Washington's the same way.
You got one question in the back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just piggybacking off of this gentleman up front's question regarding the city of Philadelphia. City of Philadelphia also made a distinction between municipally owned structures and non-municipally owned structures, right? So there's a different rate, fee for structures the city doesn't own.
That is correct, yeah. It's nowhere, I wish I could remember the exact fee, but it's nowhere near $3,000 for a non-municipally owned structure. And it's more of an access agreement than a license, whereas the municipally owned structures is more of a license agreement, yeah. Okay, all right, well, I need to release you to lunch. Thank you, and please thank our panel.